So, what do your customers and clients really value? Do you know? And is there a way to increase your prices on those things they really value and have them be happy about it? This is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. We're always trying to get the right value for the right price to the right clients and at Wealthability. So, we have an expert on this. Thank goodness. Adam Wallace, who's written about power pricing. His book is Revalue, Raise Your Prices and Build Your Legacy. I think it's a fascinating idea. I'm all for it. Not just because it's more profitable to the businesses like Wealthability, but it's also because it actually gives the clients what they want. And I actually think that that's important. If we're giving what they want and they value it, we should be charging for it. So, Adam, thank you to the Adam, welcome to the Wealthability Show. And if you would just give us a little bit of your background.
Oh, thank you for having me, Tom. Really pleased to be here. So yeah, I spent over a decade as a corporate fixer. What does that mean? Not in the Michael Clayton legal sense kind of thing, more in the UK sense of corporate fixing, where I would get a phone call, on a random day, maybe on Thursday, hey, can you be in London on a Sunday? And it was always when there was a large risk, large reward thing at stake. So often think about mega projects, building a $17 billion facility in the middle of nowhere, where every day that goes over, that's an extra $1 million and lost revenue of $2 million. Or an IT implementation at what would be the fifth largest bank for a Japanese car manufacturer from the financial services thing, where there is a time sensitive vulnerability, so to speak, that had to be responded to by getting the new project in place, and then things weren't going well. So these sort of high risk, high reward situations where I started to kind of notice the way we were able to impact them so quickly was there was always a disconnect between what the economic drivers of the project or of the business were, and then what people who were having to deliver all of the bits and bobs to fulfill that economic driver were lined up to deliver. And over time, usually those drivers would get farther away and then realize, right, we can pull them back closer. And the closer we were able to pull them back, the more value we were able to capture. Well, okay, that's big projects, complicated things and stuff like that. But a lot of my friends and family, I would be visiting with them, and they didn't quite understood what I do in those situations. They just knew I was advising businesses, and they said, "Hey, come look at my business. Come talk to me, see how I'm doing things." And sure enough, I would see the exact same situation between what they created and what their best customers were buying. That they were creating things of amazing value, but often there was a disconnect between what that was and then what their best buyers actually cared about. And the more we were able to close that disconnect and line up their product, their services, or sort of build a new offering or a refinement to their offering to close that disconnect, the more they were able to increase their pricing power and the less it cost them to actually deliver what their customers loved and was willing to pay for.
So, the most obvious question there, then, Adam, is how do you discover that? How do you find out? because because I find that clients don't always know. I
Yeah.
mean, the
Oh,
answer I get so much on a podcast like this is, well, you ask your clients. Well, I
no.
don't, I don't know that the clients always know what they value, and they certainly don't know what you deliver.
They
Um,
don't know what they value, and they sure as heck can't say it to you out loud. That's for sure. I would say one of the things you immediately run into, and I kind of compiled them as part of the chapter in the book that you mentioned, was I call them kind of pricing riptides. I live close to a surf beach, and you go out there every day, and you kind of see surfers take the riptide out. Now, the interesting things about it is most people are afraid of shark attacks at the beach, right? Like a shark will come up and kill me. But it turns out in the US, there's only been 50 people who have died of a shark attack in the past 50 years. But there's been over 250 who have died because they got caught in one of those riptides where the water was moving away from the shore and didn't know it. And often that's what happens exactly in what you were just saying. I would call that one of those riptides where, oh, okay, I need to understand what my customers value. I'll go ask them. Riptide. It's taking you farther away from the core. What I recommend doing is pay one, don't know. sort of kind of have a little bit of wonder, intentional wonder. Oh, I wonder. I don't actually know what they value. What do they spend their time on? And what do they spend their money on? And start really focusing that. Because I've met people who will complain about the price they gave them, whether it was full price, half price, a quarter of price. And then I've met people who will just doesn't really matter. And so both scientifically as well and in my personal experience, I have never found a correlation between what a person says they value and what they actually will spend their time and money on.
So how do you discover what they're spending their time and money on?
Well, what's great about an established business or entrepreneurial is you actually already have a customer base, right? So I was talking to a SaaS company founder the other day, and it's like until you get your first 10 customers, don't worry about pricing. Just find things that they find a value, deliver it to them. But it doesn't matter what industry you're in. I was talking to a CFO the other day who handled distressed debt, and he said, I did the same thing when I went into a restaurant industry. They said, oh, well, all of our customers are different, except I had them pull every ticket that they had on a Friday night, and I pulled out the highest value for seats at the table. And sure enough, 8 out of 10 of them had the exact same characteristics. They were all regulars who invited friends to go out for a weekend dinner, and those were the top spenders. And so I would start with your existing customer base and a little prior to, Pareto optimization, just the 80-20. Look, maybe we have 60% of them seem to be the ones that reliably pay our whatever it is, and we're able to continue to sell our services. Well, there's not like a fire drill on the account, a red account where we're constantly worried about losing it or so, and they just reliably continue to go with us year on year. What are their characteristics? What are their interests? What are their areas that they seem to ask about when we do have our regular meetings, if it's like a service industry, or what is it that usually prompts when they call for the next order? And begin to kind of look into what those are. Because I think that's the other sort of pricing riptides is most people who have been successful enough to create a business have found something that they know creates value for people. And they look at it from their side of the fence. You can get value for this. You can get value for this. You can get value for this.
Right.
But they end up casting too wide of a net into the marketplace, and they lose the strategic advantage of being a small entrepreneur. They copy something that works for, Walmart or Exxon or Apple, and they lose out on like those things that they could never do that you have as an advantage yourself. Which one of the biggest ones is I can be a niche professional. I can have a niche product and totally penetrate and have 45% EBITDA earnings by producing a niche product, especially in today's world, where we're no longer geographically bound at the same level we used to be, which those companies could never have. And so it's one of those ones where the more you can kind of focus on what are those characteristics, and then begin to sort of do some test case, double down, start to begin to kind of focus on what those will be to see if that begins to resonate with other people like that.
So it seems like there are probably some things that we value as the
Mhm.
owners that they don't value. How how do you identify those?
Yeah. Yeah. I often say your prospect doesn't value a better solution as much as you do, because if they were, they would be your competition. They would be in that industry, right? So I think a lot of it is you recognize what they are using your product for. It's sort of at the behavioral level. I began kind of breaking it down years ago. I used to teach at the University of Delaware, train graduate students there. And we were looking at like, okay, what drives people's behavior? Because we could tell them to go do something and then they would just not do it. And so as we were kind of breaking down, we began to see that people will spend their mental bandwidth, like actually attend to certain things, if they see it as a pathway to where they want to get to, a tool to overcome an obstacle in their way of where they're already trying to get to, a shortcut for getting there quicker, or the embodiment of the destination. And that last one's an interesting one. It's kind of like the four seasons. A lot of people think about the business as what problems do you solve? And that's a great expression. It's a great thing to know. It's a great thing to really kind of focus in on. But it often is a way for like investors or business partners to kind of understand, hey, do you really have a market here that's quantifiable as opposed to a solution in search of a problem? But I often find there's way better pricing power potential if it's an embodiment of where they want to get to. So, for example, the Four Seasons, they're not solving a problem of lodging crisis, and it would start taking a certain linguistic, turning yourself inside out to describe them as a solution for spending your vacation time. What they actually offer is sort of an embodiment of what their people actually want to achieve. Maybe it'll take a lifetime to be able to earn enough money to have your own private island, but for 1 week a year, you can live as you already do.
Interesting. Um, so in your mind, how do customers actually define value? How do they say, well, this is valuable to me?
Great question. They take the case, they value what they value. And we can't act on our values all the time in the same way. So we have to prioritize our values, right? Everybody's familiar with Maslow's hierarchy,
Right.
right? Like if you haven't had food or shelter, me saying I like high quality things doesn't really matter, right? Like it's not relevant anymore. But people will pursue what they value on a day-to-day basis. So if you begin to attend to what do they ask about? What do they talk about? What are they always aiming at? Literally in conversations, they're inquiring about something. So even your interest in this topic is probably not because it's inherent about pricing. It's probably because you see the possibility of something
Sure.
and you see this as being able to help you get there faster, help you get there easier. And that's a little bit of what every service provider, every product, every company is offering is a way to help your customers get somewhere they want to get to faster, quicker, easier. That the product that we create might be our destination, might be something we're very passionate about. But for somebody else, it's just a step on the way to something they really love.
So I was in a class the other day, and one of the exercises we did was we put down um, what do you say about your service or your product to your clients
Hmm.
versus what do they say to you about their experience?
Yeah.
And they're very different.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that, I think, is because what they say to you is after they've experienced it, right?
That's right.
So they've already experienced it, and you're saying, well, here's now, my question for you is
Mm-hmm.
because you're talking a lot about the experience and that
Mm-hmm.
destination and how
Mm-hmm.
they're feeling about it, right? So how much do you value, if you will, do you place on what they say back to you? Because, for example, we would tell people we reduce their taxes and increase their wealth, and what we get back is, you've helped me with my marriage. I sleep at night.
Peace of mind.
You've
Yeah.
changed my life. I mean, this is what we hear back, right? So,
Mhm.
so how do you actually use what they're saying to you in that pricing?
Mm. Um, so it's a tricky one, right? Because I think you described it really well when you said they are now describing it having had the experience on it. So one thing you can begin to think about is your customer journey in time. Don't treat it as oh, I can take what a customer alumni says, and that's going to resonate to attract a person for it. Right. And so the first thing I do is I just literally map out what is the customer life cycle of a product. All products and services have a life cycle, whether we want to kind of admit it or not. Sometimes fast fashion, it's a quarter, it's 3 months. Sometimes it's an industry and it's hopefully 200 years. But there's always a life cycle. And so if I can begin to map out a company's individual life cycle, and then I can put that feedback somewhere on that life cycle. And it's a great insight. It's very valuable. Matter of fact, I can leverage that feedback in testimonials, in communications, build credibility, kind of build a whole sort of social engagement around the value that I create. I just can't collapse that with the same thing at the very beginning of that life cycle. What is the one or two or sometimes three, but usually just one or two things that is the first thing that when a person hears that, here's what you're looking for. You're not looking for them to say, that's interesting. Oh, that's very valuable. Oh, I can see why people love that. All you're looking for is they want to talk to you more about it. They want to hear more about it. Our most valuable commodity is our time, like full stop. So on the very front end of that life cycle, all we're looking for is being able to say something in a way that technically what we're talking about doing is matching a person's salience landscape. Salience landscape meaning the how they perceive the world and the objects in it. So it has to match it, yet it has to be novel in a slightly surprising way. Meaning, meaning it has to be 80% what they're expecting. Oh yeah, I know that. Because if it's less than 80% of what they're expecting, they don't know what the heck you're talking about. And
Mm,
so unless, they're just kind of captured or their friend or you're talking over the dinner, they're not going to give you the time of day to figure out what you're talking about. So that 80% has to match. And then the 20% has to be sort of like, the shave and a haircut, but you'd leave off the last beat. It's like, wait, but there should have been something there. Or every time I've heard somebody say this, it's this, but you're saying it somehow differently. That's what tends to grab our attention at sort of a base attention underpinning physiological point of view. And so once
makes
it
sense.
hooks that, then I can start going into the next phase. But it really is breaking down just that first one of how do you say it in such a way I remember building one product and we were testing it out. We came up with an idea and we were kind of testing it out. And one guy who went out and tested it out met with an old, a good client of his that they'd been meeting for a while. He was having his regular thing. And then he's like, okay, I got to test this out. So he's literally shaking his hand, leaving and says, oh, the next time we meet, remind me to tell you about Humma Humma. The guy stops him and says, no, now. That's exactly
Yeah,
what I want to hear about. So he literally bumps his next
I
meeting
love it.
and sits him back down at the table. And all he said was like the label that we put on it, but it so spoke to the challenge that he had, the nature of the issue, and it cut to the core of it just in a simple little label. But that's what we're looking for. We're looking for people's time.
I like it. So how do you actually get to selling that value? So I like the 80-20 rule.
Mm,
That's terrific because I find the same thing. I have to give them 80%, if I'm on stage or if I'm in a conversation. Here's 80%. Here's things that you're kind of expecting to get, but
mhm.
because they've got to understand it, right? But that 20% is, oh, wait a minute. That's that aha moment, right?
Yeah, yeah,
So
yep.
they go, well, that's not what everybody else is telling me. How how do you turn that into value, and how do you sell that?
So I would say the first step is the one we just described. The next step I'm going to go to the principle as opposed to the techniques because I think a lot of people already know the techniques in it. The principle is the more time a person spends exploring an option, the more they will end up valuing it, right? So if you kind of think about it in a certain way, the people you can unlock the most value for is the person who's never even considered your solution before or your product before. They're the person who's primed to have their
Got it.
mind blown, right? So they're the person who's actually going to be your most loyal fan and pay you what you need because it's not like they're comparing you to, oh, I've already had Tom do it, but you're doing it maybe 5% better or 20% better, or even 50% better. They've just never had it. So, if you're going to a person who's just always been, in your service of like reducing taxes, no, I just pay. I just pay all the time. And then you actually have something to offer. Now, the issue is in that first part is they've never explored it because it hasn't sufficiently matched what they value. So if you once you get it to match what they value, then it becomes a game of what you're, when I mentioned sort of the methods and tactics, what you're already doing, give engage with them over time to build a higher resolution picture of what it is that they get out of it and how it actually maps to their life. Now, there's one important caveat on it, and I would say it's kind of at the end of that phase. The first sort of what you sell, that one is going to be interesting because what we find, especially if the intention is to increase the pricing power, is um, everybody wants to test out a product to find, like whatever you say, whatever your past clients say, whatever other people say is not nearly as persuasive as what I say to myself after I've had an experience. So there's an element of building in that first initial offer. And I hate loss leader offers. I actually advocate the opposite. I would say your initial offer has to have some of your highest margin built into it. Um, but have an easy to say yes to that then allows them to step from exploring without any sort of price commitment
Got it.
to, okay, exploring and experiencing directly themselves with a price commitment. So that, because if you don't do that and you just stretch out the offering value, what you'll find is you end up getting an audience who will never be your buyer. And there's nothing wrong with that, depending on what you're doing, right? Like I'm here without anything to sell. I'm just interested in this topic and I wanted to share it. So that can be totally fine. But if your intention is to feed the pipeline into your product and service, you have to do that and then transition into the first sale. But just know they need comfort with you. They need, in order to take a new action, in order to embrace a different way of thinking, that first basic cognitive behavior therapy, that first step has to be reduced down into a size that I can easily be a two-way door. I can step out if I don't like it. I'm not stuck, but let me try it. And then there's nothing more persuasive than your personal experience.
So you're what I'm hearing is you're actually describing a bit of a sales funnel. So they're starting with that very first thing.
Hmm.
So obviously the first thing in marketing is going to be free, right? And then there's going to be some little thing, and then you're kind of building up to, okay, now you've got an experience with me. I'm ready to go. Now some people obviously will go straight to the big ticket item, right? I mean, those are like they're like your easiest sales. But most people, it seems like what you're saying is they need an experience with you. They need to
That's right.
experience you first
That's right.
and value you and
Yeah,
value that relationship.
that's right. And that's us. Everyone's different. I often what I focus on is I just own a portfolio of companies that I take a stake in and then work with them to do this. So a lot of what I focus on is B2B, professional services,
Mhm.
software companies. I don't do a lot of B2C other than close friends and stuff like that. So I do always sometimes question with the traditional sales funnel of having the most easy, democratized things feeding in because you do lose that personal experience, that
Right.
personal connection, that thing that actually motivates and drives to. And so often I wonder on, and it depends on the model, everyone's a little bit different, but whatever it is, you really are looking for designing an experience where that person has the, it's sometimes it's the, we need a bigger boat. Oh, now I see. This is a bigger opportunity, or this is a bigger challenge than what I was thinking before, and then the shoulders kind of drop. And it's like, okay, now I can see how this can work.
So that I think this is really interesting conversation because I think of Apple and I'm going
Mm-hmm.
that you go to the Apple store, that's a different experience.
Mm-hmm.
And there's, and how you feel about Apple, some of it's
Mm-hmm.
going to depend on how fast you get served, right? When you
Yeah,
first walk in the store.
totally.
Or, I mean, that's true with any store, right? How
Yep.
do you get served? How do people approach you? One of the things that I've always appreciated about McDonald's is here's a company that's run by 16-year-olds. I mean, let's face it, that's really what's going on.
Hmm.
The face of McDonald's is that 16-year-old clerk that you walk into. And if they greet you with a smile and how are you doing, it's a very different experience than
Mm,
if, if they've had a bad day,
mm-mm.
right?
Yep.
So that initial experience, I think this is a really good, important point. Now, how do you actually go about when you go back to your business?
Mhm.
How do you find which services or products you're actually undervaluing?
Mm. Oh, you mean like an opportunity of like, oh, I want to go to
Well,
walk.
so I've got this great thing. I'm
Hmm.
clearly not valuing it enough. I could price it higher, but I don't know that I could price it higher because I don't even know that the customers, it may be like an ancillary value. Let me give you an
Hmm.
example.
Yeah, yeah.
So in my industry, I have a very weird industry, the CPA industry, because people tend to sell tax returns, right? Which nobody values,
Yeah.
right? But then they'll
Yep.
give away tax consulting,
That's
which
right.
is hugely valuable.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Yep.
so, so, so I even have a hard time convincing my cohorts uh,
Hmm.
in the industry. Hey, you ought to actually be selling this instead of giving it away because right now, I mean, they'll give away the consulting to get the tax return, which I think to me is backwards. You should give away the tax return to get the consulting.
That's right.
Um, so how do you go about identifying that?
Well, I think that's a perfect example of what it is. Um, it usually is a little bit of benchmarking it to other industries that you might not. This, I mean, I'm just saying how I do it.
Mhm.
Is so I was helping a buddy the other day. He owns a construction firm, and he charges for quotes. Nobody charges for quotes for home remodeling, high end
Mm.
things like that. He charges like $5,000 to $10,000 for a quote. You want a quote from him? 5 to 10,000 on it. And I was helping him actually do it because he wasn't able to charge for requotes, and so I was just giving him a little way of charging for requotes. But part of it is to be just very very clear on here is what my offering is. Now you got to remember price serves two functions. Price obviously determines your revenue, right? But it's also a signal. Price is always a signal. It's a signal of value. So, most of us don't know the ins and outs of every wine region in the world. So when we walk
Mm.
into a wine list or something like that, what's the signal we use for, okay, what's the level of quality here? Right? What level am I going for? Well, it's the one consistent thing that's on every bottle, which is the price they're charging for it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's actually going to what should I expect?
That's right. That's right. Now you have to be very careful with this because a buddy of mine, Yuri Nizi, uh, one of the top behavioral economists in the world, he always points out, like, if you disappoint them,
Yeah.
the backlash is going to be heavy. So
Yep.
this is a game that this is the game so worth playing in my mind, but it's a game that you have to be very, very serious about. Because if you say my advice is worth $10,000, you better be delivering $50,000 worth of savings or values. So then you got a 5 to 1 capture ratio, and the person's like, oh, okay, yeah, that was worth 10,000. But what I find is exactly what you just said. Most people are trying to sell something else, and they've actually, in the process, created something way more valuable that they're undervaluing. And the number of times that I've gone into an organization and, like, take me through your suite of offerings, and it's like the third step that they don't even say that they do is like, no, that's what your customers are buying. Like all of this other stuff, they're really just kind of saying yes to because they get the peace of mind. They avoid the argument with the wife every quarter because you're on top of it and she has a different level of confidence on it. Okay. If that's what I'm selling, that's what I'm selling. If that's what they're willing to pay more for, who am I to judge what they value? I can just enable it for them.
So how do you identify that?
Um,
So
so
so when you
mhm,
come, give it, if you would give us an example. So you walk into a company and just like you were saying, and you go, okay, here's your steps. This is the one.
mhm,
You know, because you've got a lot of experience that
mhm.
that's the one.
Yeah,
How do
yeah.
you know?
So, dude, okay, great question. So you come up with a premise. It's sort of like being a scientist for the weekend. All right, I see this evidence on now. I think I have a thesis as to it. Let me go test the thesis. So one that I had was there was a leadership development company, and they were selling developing leaders. And then the person who was hiring them says, "Oh, like literally as they were selling leadership development, he kept on saying, I just want me and my team on the same page." Oh, that's interesting because unlike giving feedback about me and my service, when I ask you, what do you like about my service? He's not giving the feedback on my service. He's saying what he wants, what he cares about, what he's motivated to get. And so there is a time to listen to the customer, to kind of say the opposite or add a distinction in what we are talking about before. Don't listen to the customer about what they say about you and why they buy from you. Listen to the customer when they say, this is what I want, unadorned about you. That's what they're trying to get to. So he was buying this whole suite of services in order just to get him and his team on the same page. And he had experienced that doing that previously. So here's what happened a few years later. Okay, great. Instead of having to buy the entire suite of services, they could actually get him and his team on in a quarter of the time, but there was no need to charge him less for it. So then that increased what I
Interesting.
do is the pricing power for it, because that's what he was willing to pay $500,000 for, was that level of clarity in that situation, because it was costing him, that lack of clarity and alignment was costing him so much
Mm,
money on a day-to-day, month-to-month basis, that it was no problem in order to create it, right? It was no problem in order to spend the extra. But when you got really clear what he was going to, it's like, oh, okay, how can we organize ourselves to deliver that value unconstrained by how we traditionally have gone about it?
What's interesting, I'm thinking of a couple of
Mm-hmm.
situations, of course,
Mm-hmm.
in my experience. And in one case, they flat out told me this
Mm-hmm.
is what's valuable to me. And the other case, it wasn't until after we did it that they go, "Oh, I love that." So for example,
Mm-hmm.
we sell a say 3 to 6 month process
Mm-hmm.
to develop a tax strategy. And we're I'm going through it with this one client, and it's a little expensive when I do it personally.
Mm-hmm.
And so back then we were charging, I think I was charging $75,000 for this process.
Mm-hmm.
And we've created a map of his entities, and here's what they should be. And he goes, "I'm done."
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah.
That's all he wanted.
That's right.
It was totally worth it to him.
That's right.
The rest of it, he was not even interested. But that
Yep.
one thing he was absolutely interested in. In a different situation,
Mm-hmm.
different client paid the same price, but what they wanted was they wanted my connections.
Mm-hmm.
They wanted to be connected to the people I was connected to.
Yep.
That's what they wanted to. So my challenge here, which I'm going to
Mm-hmm.
pursue with you for just for a
Yeah,
minute,
yeah.
is different clients that seem to be the same
Mm-hmm.
want different things.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you identify? Is that the salesperson's job to identify what it is? Is that what you're trying to
Oh,
do? Is get the salesperson to identify that so that they can kind of emphasize that? Or is there a way to identify, kind of what does 80% of the group want?
yeah. No, no, that's a great question. That's a great question. Here's what I find myself doing. And it's such a great question. It's not one that I've thought about before, but here's what I often do to handle that issue. Often going from services, and I always like hone in on what is the deliverable, like as a product
Sure.
itself. So, instead of selling the product, it's like, what is the deliverable? Because the deliverable becomes sort of an object. And when different people, and this goes back into the sort of underpinnings of everything I write about on value, is people perceive objects differently based on obviously the background and what they care about. And so when you start, like if you're in a service firm and you start to productize your
Mhm.
offering, it allows different people to see it and relate to it differently and have different value unlocked for them, even though what you're doing every single time is the same. Because the problem is if you over index on what they value, you start to create a new product or a new delivery strategy or a new way of
Right.
operating, which you can do, but then you're never going to scale. and you're
Right.
never going to train people in it, and you're never
Right.
going to grow. So, okay, that doesn't work, but it's exactly what you just said when you said the 80/20. If I can identify, no, no, that is the thing that 80% of people want. Now, then I can allow for variations. Well, why does Tom want it? Oh, okay. Well, it's a little bit different than why Sue wants it, which is a little bit different than why Rachel wants it. To your point, I definitely want my salesperson to be telling me this is why they want this. And I definitely want whoever is delivering the service to know. So as they're doing it, they can speak into that set of concerns and that value to make sure we're reliably delivering it. But that doesn't mean I have to change my product in order to unlock it, because my product becomes the
I see.
embodiment of getting it. Yeah.
And then it just means that you're going to, obviously the client is going to want you to emphasize that one part of your product.
It becomes sort of the orientation your team has when delivering about it. It's your call outs, it's your examples, they just know, okay, that's the bullseye. We're not reinventing our process, but like if there's five numbers that we normally show the client at the end that care about this one, okay, that one goes on top. Right. Like it's a very, because that's why they're buying. That's why they care about it. So we can lead with that. We can make sure they get that in spades.
That's great. This is great stuff. This is Adam, great stuff. If you would, could you give us two or three steps that you think any business owner, entrepreneur ought to take to get started down this path?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Um, so the final riptide that pricing riptide that I write about is past pricing creates future expectations. So if you have an existing client base, step one almost always is fear of screwing it up. I'm losing clients if I try to raise my prices. The second part of that riptide is, but your future isn't written yet, and you don't know what it is. So what I highly recommend, and this is what I normally do when I find a company I find is being undervalued, and I sign a letter of intent. And then for a period of time, all we do is we begin to raise their prices and do these test cases and hone in on what it is to see if there is the right response. And when I say test case, I'm not talking about raising prices by like 3% or 30%. I'm talking about three times. I'm talking about multiple of three times for it, by getting really clear on what the value proposition is for that audience, or what the need is, or the reduction of services in order to hit that one bullseye that that person is willing to spend 75,000 on. I don't have to deliver all this other stuff. I can unlock it quicker. So the first thing I would do is, it's the ABCs of raising your prices. The first thing is to align and socialize. If you have an idea of where you think you can do it, if you have other leaders, other owners, whatever the case is, know that anytime you raise prices, you absolutely do risk losing a customer, right? There's no silver bullet though. That's okay. Especially if you go back to our conversation about Pareto optimizing your customer base.
Yeah,
Trust me, if you run a service firm, you probably have 10 to 20% of your
for
customers
sure.
that you're losing money on based on the number of emails, the number of phone calls, the number of questions that come. So if you were to actually do the heavy lift of some sort of the business
Right.
analysis, okay, so you can identify and align with your partners and leadership team. Look, if we lose half of those people, that's okay. That's actually better for us. So you kind of make a case where you say, we're willing to abandon this experiment if these are the costs, but we're also willing to hold the course if these are the costs, right? If all I'm losing is people from that area, no problem. So that's A on it. B is beta test. Always begin to roll out a price change or a new offering in a sub-segment of your business. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. And sometimes these rollouts can just be, okay, we're going to just simply do it on new proposals. That's one of the easiest
Right.
ones. New
Right.
proposals going forward, right? There's no pricing history, there's no things. Let me just test that out. And sometimes it becomes a fun game, because part of what you can align on is, look, we're going to test out a 10% increase, we're going to test out a twofold increase, and we're going to see which one's better. And you will be surprised. Most people think from a supply and demand curve. But going back to the wine analogy, when did tests in a winery, the actual as they raised the price, they sold more bottles
Hmm.
until they got to another level, and then they sold equal amount as to the lower price. So a wine that they were selling blind taste test multiple times a day over multiple weeks in order to normalize it as much as possible. This was your one of your studies as well. As they raised the price up on, and the only thing that was different in the experience was the card for ordering wine afterwards. They sold just as many bottles at $20, at $60, and they sold about 70% more at $40 because the price went up. So going back to price is also a signal of your service. So that's a little bit of what you're beginning to look for in your beta testing is try a couple of different positions. Because the idea that you're going to know immediately right out of the bat that we're worth a 25% raise,
Right.
I mean, we're just making it up, frankly. Like we need to actually test a couple of things and see. Then you do the commercial rollout. And a commercial rollout can, again, be phased and over time. But if you really you asked, something simple that people can take and go away, because especially now, I'm getting more and more kind of just casual questions walking to the car in the parking lot about,
Sure.
hey, inflation, I got to raise my rates again. Like my suppliers are going, I got to pass on these costs. I just had to raise my team's salary this
Yep.
year. And so same thing. So even those ABCs, align and socialize, beta test, and commercial rollout, even if it's just a 5% increase to keep up with inflation, it's a great way of doing it. So you really de-risk the process of changing your prices.
So what's your third one? So I got the A and the B. Is there a C?
The C is the commercial rollout.
Oh,
So
okay.
the when you actually start executing it,
Got it.
because a lot of times people will throw it over the fence and then there's no feedback loop, or you have a person who's like now dealing with you have the salesperson who's now dealing with the customer who's complaining about it, but there wasn't that alignment and appreciation. It's like, yeah, but are they still a client? Yeah, we still delivering value, so a bit of the commercial rollout is making sure that you tend to your team in what we're expecting. Yes, we're expecting 3 people to leave. That's happy making to us. So then they don't get worried and then start asking for
Got it.
discounts or concessions or undermine your process. So that's the third one, is just really making sure you appreciate you will have a 3 to 6 month life cycle of the new pricing, and making sure everybody in your team knows
Got it.
wheel the sides of the roads are that we're happy making with anything in this range. Flag us if it's over here.
Got it. That makes sense. So the book is Revalue, Raise Your Prices, and Build Your Legacy. And your website, I believe, is adamwallace.com, correct?
That is correct. Yes.
So this has been terrific, Adam. This is such an important, frankly, daily issue for entrepreneurs, investors. It doesn't matter if you're selling widgets, you're selling services, or frankly, you're renting an office building. Prices are, price and value is what it comes down to. And this is the type of thing that we talk about on the Wealthability Show. For more information, please go to wealthability.com, look at our other podcasts, and check out Adam's book, Revalue, Raise Your Prices, and Build Your Legacy. Thanks again, Adam Wallace, and thank you all for listening. Remember, as we get this type of information, we really focus on our financial education, we're always going to make way more money and pay way less tax. We'll see everyone next time.
This podcast is a presentation of Rich Dad Media Network.